We're having the same discussion now, pretty much, that policymakers had in 1986, just about 25 years ago. And according to CBO's report yesterday, we'll be having the same debate again very soon indeed, if the bill passes and their estimate becomes true, because they estimate that it will reduce unlawful immigration by only 25%. So if Congress passes amnesty again, we have every reason to expect that another generation of analysts will be having this same debate, perhaps in this very room. Third, amnesty is costly. Heritage is still the only group to do a fiscal analysis calculating how much an amnesty will cost the federal, state, and local taxpayers. Robert Rector looked at household costs over a lifetime, the only legitimate way to get a sense of what the bill will ultimately cost. Many of the costs will, as I said before, occur outside of the budget window, and we know that they will add up to trillions of dollars. A reformed immigration system that works would get nearly all of the economic growth that we could get from immigration without unnecessary costs of an unfair, unworkable, and costly amnesty. Rector's research shows that high-skilled immigrants, for example, lessen the tax burden on other Americans and lawful immigrants. So we need a rational, workable approach to immigration reform with good policy. Come on up, Bill. Just come on up. Thanks for coming. Good to see you. Good to see you. Congress has an opportunity to do this the right way, not the usual way. We've seen it before, a convoluted 1,000-page plus bill that looks like Obamacare and scores well from the CBO. We end up with a policy that costs way more than we thought, and it's one that we have to pass to find out what's really in it. So with that, let me introduce first Robert Rector, and then I'll introduce Bill Beach, and then we'll get to your questions. Robert Rector is a leading authority on poverty, welfare programs, and immigration, and he has been so for 3 decades. He is our senior research fellow in domestic policy. Dubbed the intellectual godfather of welfare reform by the National Review, Rector concentrates on a range of related issues, including the collapse of the marriage culture, especially in low-income communities. Rector played a major role in crafting the 1996 federal welfare reform legislation, which, for the first time, required recipients to work or get job training in exchange for benefits. Since its passage, he has continued to examine not only the mounting costs to taxpayers at nearly $1 trillion a year, but the role of welfare spending in undermining families. Rector's impact on national policy includes the debate over how to fix our broken immigration system, both today and the last time around. His current research on long-term fiscal costs of granting amnesty to an estimated 11 million unlawful immigrants builds on his influential work that he started first 7 years ago. Rector joined Heritage in 1984. He previously worked as a legislative assistant in the Virginia House of Delegates and as an analyst in the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. He served on the congressionally mandated Millennial Housing Commission as well. He holds a bachelor's degree from the College of William & Mary and a master's degree in political science from Johns Hopkins University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Robert Rector.
The CBO, in its infinite wisdom, has told us that bringing in large numbers of immigrants will, in fact, help the taxpayer reduce the deficits because they're going to pay more in taxes than they will take out in benefits. Now, interestingly, last week, the OECD did a 300-page report on the fiscal consequences of immigration. And among the things that the OECD, generally nonpartisan in the U.S. sense, concluded was that all immigrants in the United States, on average, impose a net fiscal cost in the sense that their benefits exceed the taxes they pay in, and the net fiscal cost of all immigrants in the United States is $140 billion a year. I estimated the same thing, and I concluded it was $110 billion a year, so I guess I'm to the left of the OECD. But the fact of the matter is that the average household in the United States, when you set aside net interest and national defense, receives about $32,000 a year in government benefits. So that would mean that the average household has to pay $32,000 a year in taxes in order to break even. And the bottom line is that if you have highly educated households, they not only break even with a college degree, they will pay about $30,000 a year more in taxes than they receive in benefits. If you have, however, households that have not a college degree, or particularly those that have only a high school degree or less, they will receive considerably more in benefits than they pay in taxes over time. And that's why the OECD says, in fact, immigration in the U.S. has a higher fiscal cost than in almost any other OECD country, because immigration in the U.S. is predominantly low-skilled, predominantly households that receive more in benefits over time than they pay in taxes. Now, the CBO, again, in its infinite wisdom, has told us that irrespective of this kind of basic common sense, that you would think then from that even if the immigrants were coming in who were matched U.S. households on average, that there would be no net gain. They would just be benefits, taxes, they'd cancel each other out over time, and that would at least not hurt the U.S. taxpayers. But the fact is that the immigration coming in under this bill looks like previous immigration in the sense that it's predominantly lower skill, plus the fact that you're taking 11 million illegal immigrants and potentially giving them access to the welfare and entitlement states. They have an average education of 10th grade. So it's very difficult to imagine that those households somehow would pay enough in taxes to equal their benefits, given what OECD has told us in general and what the basic math of achieving a fiscal balance is. The trick is the CBO 10-year budget window. For mysterious reasons that we would probably need several PhD dissertations on this, for mysterious reasons, when an amnesty bill is written, the amnesty recipients become eligible for everything under the sun in about the 11th year, okay? So that they pay taxes in the first 10 years and they don't get additional benefits for some mysterious reason until you move outside the CBO budget window. And so under the CBO budget window, every amnesty bill and every immigration bill inherently looks fiscally good, because the way the bill is designed, which is you pay taxes now and we hide any benefits that you're going to get until CBO is going to count them or not, or marginally count them. The other factor is that basically it's very important to look at immigration, both federal and state and local. And the reason for that is that the federal government, because of Social Security and Medicare, inherently transfers from the non-elderly to the elderly, okay? State and local governments kind of do the opposite. If you just look at state and local governments, you would find that they transfer from the elderly to the non-elderly to pay for education. The elderly pay a lot of property tax. They don't get any education benefits anymore. And so if you just had looked at that little stream, you have the reverse flow. And therefore, if you just look at the federal government alone and you conceal benefits for the first 10 or 15 years, and so forth, what you get is, of course, immigrants are not elderly themselves. For a limited period of time, they pay in, but then they take out more than they have paid in. It's important to put both flows together because the opposite process is happening down at the state and local level. But other reasons why the CBO has a very low number. Most people accept that there are a minimum of 11.5 million illegal immigrants in the country today. It could be considerably more than that because there are 10 million of them in the census. We don't know how many are here but don't appear in the census. CBO, in its infinite wisdom, says that out of that minimum of 11.5 million, only 5.7 million are going to receive amnesty and proceed on to get benefits. So it's 50%, okay? Now, how did they achieve that calculation? Well, they don't tell us. CBO never tells you anything. You say, how did you get that calculation, CBO? We don't need to explain how we got that calculation. We're CBO, okay? No numbers are ever explained by CBO because they're above that. But let's say, because I'm sure that the Gang of Eight is going to say, hey, look, there are no costs here, and there are no costs because the amnesty recipients really don't get amnesty. A lot of them apparently get amnesty and then go home, according to the CBO model. It's quite remarkable, okay, before they get Social Security and Medicare. I don't know why they're doing that. The CBO won't tell us why they're doing that, but they're doing that under CBO. So I thought one of the things is, well, CBO wouldn't be inaccurate. It wouldn't be wrong. So if CBO is telling us that only 1 in 2 illegal immigrants are actually going to get benefits over time, we ought to just write that in the law, because we're making our budgetary decision based on that estimate. The estimate couldn't be inaccurate. And so we could just say, all right, we all agree that less than 6 million illegal immigrants will get amnesty and pass on to receive benefits. We'll just cap it at that because we're making our economic and budgetary decisions based on that basis. I'm sure the Gang of Eight will go along with it, don't you think? Well, okay, maybe we could give a little leeway. I mean, maybe it's more than 5.7 million. Since we don't know how many illegal immigrants are in the country, it might possibly be more than 1 in 2 who would get amnesty and benefits. So let's say, Gang of Eight, let's cap it at 7 million. They'd go for that, right? Maybe we could cap it at 8 million. Maybe we could cap it at 9 million. I don't think the Gang of Eight are actually going to give us any cap because they want an unlimited amnesty. And they don't want to tell us how many are going to get it in advance, but they're going to rely on a score that says only 1 in 2 actually get it. In fact, in 1986, when we gave the last amnesty, 1 out of 4 people that received amnesty received it fraudulently. But we can rest assured that that won't happen again because CBO tells us that that will not happen again. And CBO is seldom wrong. In addition, one of the interesting things that CBO does tell us is that the number of illegal immigrants who will enter the country over the next 20 years goes down by only 25%. And there would have been, they estimate, 10 million illegal immigrants entering over the next 20 years. They estimate that that will drop to 7.5 million illegal immigrants entering the country, which is remarkable given that this is the toughest border security bill of all time, and that the bill includes vigorous provisions such as having a plan to seal the border before we grant amnesty or grant green card status. I mean, what could be tougher than that, okay? Interestingly, the triggers that allow the illegal immigrants to pass on to green card status and citizenship do not include an actual reduction in the number of illegal immigrants as counted yearly by the Census Bureau, because that would be fairly objective. What they have are standards like saying we're going to have a 90% interception rate at the border. 9 out of 10 people that try to cross the border are going to be, well, we're going to have a plan to intercept 9 out of 10, not an actual interception rate. But even if it was an interception rate, this is 90% of a number that's inherently unknowable, which is Washington to a T, okay? And we could all have confidence in that number. But one number that you could have some confidence in would just be the total number of illegals that are reporting entering the country under the Census Bureau each year, which most people agree is a pretty good minimal standard. Under this bill, that number can go up year by year, and you still have the triggers. It doesn't trigger anything. You can still declare the border secure. And CBO is telling us that at least 7.5 million illegals will enter and reside in the country over 20 years as a result of the legislation. The net cost of those illegals alone would be about $400 billion over that period. Another thing that CBO does tell us is that overall, this bill, they believe, will bring in 16 million new immigrants. That would be added to an immigrant base under current law of around 14 million. And then you have the 7.5 million illegals that they predict will come in. That's a total of around 38 million immigrants coming in. And then they are going to grant amnesty to 7 or 8 million, and that number tapers off. So we're way over 40 million individuals being granted green card status under this bill. We're roughly doubling the rate of immigration coming into the country. And very interestingly, of that 45 or 44 million immigrants and individuals granted green card status, only about 5 million of those are skill-based. And when you listen to the Gang of Eight explain their bill, and these are CBO's own numbers, when you look at the Gang of Eight explain their bill, they always say, oh, we're shifting from low-skill immigration to high-skill immigration. You can trust us. That's what we do. But in fact, the numbers from CBO show exactly the opposite, that roughly 85 to 90% of the individuals getting green card status are not skill-based and would in fact be relatively low or moderate skilled individuals. One indication of that that's fairly interesting is that they have a new visa category for so-called temporary workers, low-skilled temporary workers. CBO projects that there will be 2.3 million low-skilled temporary workers in 2033. The number of high-skilled temporary workers will be roughly 1/7 of that brought in under the bill. So the ratio of low-skill to high-skill is roughly 7 to 1. That's what we mean by focusing on high skill here in Washington. You have to learn to speak Washington lingo in order to understand things. And then finally, there's an interesting point that this bill, that the second score, there are two scores provided by CBO here, provides a rather astonishing result that the immigrant flow coming in, which they say is high skill in that part of the report, is going to cause an increase of 1% in total factor productivity. Now, those of you that aren't in economics, that's a pretty big deal, a 1% increase in total factor productivity. And that's like a double, triples, quadruple wow, right? And so I looked at that and they said, you know, and this so forth. So total factor productivity is something I've studied, you know. So I this afternoon I did a Google Scholar search and I looked up all the articles I could find on total factor productivity. I found 2,410 of them. And I looked up total factor productivity in immigration. I found 0. I was really surprised at that, you know, because if all you need to do is bring in a few 100,000 high-skilled workers and you get a boost of total factor productivity of 1%, this would seem to be a very rich field of research. There should be just economists just pouring all over this, okay? But in fact, even though they're claiming that this effect occurs, they can only cite 4 articles that roughly say maybe that might sort of perhaps happen out of 2,400 articles on total factor productivity. So it's not exactly a blossoming field of research, I would guess. But also, ironically, they also cite 4 articles that say this doesn't have any effect. Immigration does not improve total factor productivity. Therefore, you wouldn't get all of these increases. And CBO, in its infinite wisdom, says, well, we have 4 articles. There's basically nothing on this in the literature, but we have 4 articles that say it might happen and 4 articles that say it wouldn't happen. Therefore, we're going with the 4 articles that say it does happen. And that's one of the ways that they get a lot of the long-term revenue increase and so forth, is simply by this assumption. Now, I would never disparage CBO, but the fact of the matter is that CBO isn't exactly doesn't exactly have the best track record in respect to these things. CBO is the institution that told us that Obamacare wouldn't cost us any money, and it used the same kinds of tricks it's using today. That all the cost of Obamacare were put beyond the 10-year budget window. But I also had experience with CBO when I did welfare reform back in 1996. And CBO told us when we were trying to replace the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program with a work-based program, they said that requiring AFDC recipients to work would have no effect on the caseload, 0 effect on the caseload whatsoever, and that it would cost more money. And I said, well, I'm not sure that's exactly right. And fortunately, the Republicans used my analysis, and they basically told CBO where to go, okay? And the reality was, after we put that reform into effect, the AFDC caseload plummeted by about 70% within a few years as a result of the work requirements. CBO was completely inaccurate and remains completely inaccurate on that score today. It's also a kind of odd question as to why, when CBO makes mistakes, they seem to make mistakes in a leftward direction. But they are nonpartisan, and so really that must be just a coincidence. The fact of the matter is that if you take a body of 11 million immigrants who have an average education of 10th grade and give them access to 80 different means-tested welfare programs, Obamacare, Social Security, and Medicare, there's a huge net cost to that over time. I predict that the net cost of that in federal, state, and local benefits, most of which occurs outside the CBO budget window, will be that those individuals over their lifetimes will receive $9 trillion in benefits, will pay $3 trillion in taxes, for a net cost of $6 trillion. Congress has yet to figure out how that will be paid for, but I'm sure they will have no problem resolving that. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Now I'll introduce our next panelist, Bill Beach. William Beach serves as the chief economist for the Senate Budget Committee and the minority staff. Prior to that position, he was the Lazoff Family Fellow in Economics here at Heritage and the director of our Center for Data Analysis. As the CDA director, Bill oversaw Heritage's original statistical research on a variety of topics. He was instrumental in developing the state-of-the-art econometric models that Heritage uses to estimate in detail how, for example, proposed tax changes will affect individuals and families in various business sectors, as well as the overall national economy. Prior to joining Heritage in 1995, Beach served as an economist for Missouri's Office of Budget and Planning, where he designed and managed the state's econometric model and advised the governor on revenue and economic issues. After a stint in the corporate headquarters of Sprint United, Inc., Beach moved to Washington, D.C. to serve as the president of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. A graduate of Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas, Beach also holds a master's degree in history and economics from the University of Missouri-Columbia. He is a visiting fellow in economics at Buckingham University in the United Kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bill Beach.
Well, I almost didn't get here, so that's why I was late. I apologize, but until the very last second, we were wondering whether I needed to be on the floor to, improve the general tenor of the Republic or be over here. And it was voted that my highest and best use was to get off the floor and be over here. No, today we are, as we have been for the past week, debating this extremely important piece of legislation, Senate Bill 744, which is a comprehensive reform of the nation's immigration laws. And it's something that everyone in this audience, whether you're here or listening, should pay close attention to. It will affect your lives. This debate is a good debate. It's a debate in the true spirit of the Senate. The Senate is a place where we are continuously frustrated by inactivity until they are active, and then we're frustrated by the fact that they're too active. Let me start off by saying a few things good about CBO. I share many of the frustrations that Robert has told you about and the truths that he has documented. But I will say this about the product or the products which are in front of you today from the Congressional Budget Office. They are amazing. It is very, very difficult to do the work that they did. Anyone who has done comprehensive immigration work of any sort, but certainly a comprehensive bill, must appreciate the steps, the hoops, the many things that CBO had to do to get to their end product. And they will not be uncriticized by that. But we need to first start with a thank you that they did this work. We have, in the Senate Budget Committee, where I'm the chief economist, we have been urging Doug Elmendorf and his colleagues to move beyond the 10-year scoring window on this bill. They had no need to do so. The law requires only that they show us within a 10-year window, but they conceded the obvious point that since all the provisions became fully active in years 11 and after, it would make no sense at all to have a 10-year scoring window. And so they did 20 years, and we'd actually asked them to do 40. So maybe next year or the next time we'll get 30. I think that's a good thing. We asked them, please show us the economic effects using modeling and the standard economics that are out there, and they did that. Now, I think that their product could have been much better documented. We're lacking a methodological appendix, which is standard operating procedure at the Center for Data Analysis here. Transparency needs a big step forward, but I know the good folks who work in the macroeconomics division at CBO, and they did a lot. So what does the report say? Well, if you take all of your news from the senior senator from New York, it is the last word on the immigration bill, taking away the last piece of critique from the opponents. Senator Schumer rose yesterday during morning business, which happens, by the way, always after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that this scoring shows that the deficits will be lower and the economy stronger, and that is the last word. Well, it actually isn't the last word, because what the report says is quite a bit different than that. And so rather than interpret the report today, I would like to simply tell you what's in the report. So let's start with a very simple and obvious fact. Okay, let's suppose we're selling popcorn in here. By the way, Derek, this is a way to build attendance. Sell popcorn. And there were 10 people in this room buying popcorn. And then suddenly we had 20 buying the same unit amount. Would we sell more or less popcorn? Well, if you're having trouble with that, see me afterwards. But you would sell more. And it's the same thing with the economy. When you increase the population, through immigration in this case, or through natural fertility, however you do it, but particularly if you increase the adult population, the economy grows, it's bigger. And so the CBO found that in the first 10 years, the level of the economy, not the growth rate, the level of the economy, because of the increased number of people, is 3% more. And in the second 10 years, remember they did a 20-year look, it's 5% more. They have not told you anything about the growth rate. Now, if they told you that the growth rate was 3% as opposed to 2%, or 5% as opposed to 4%, that's a take-home. That's a big piece of news, because that means that your marginal value, your marginal gain, your marginal income, whatever, is probably going to be more. But all they've told you about is the level at this point. They have given us a helpful page. If you want to take notes, you'll find it on page 15 of the cost estimate. There are two documents that the CBO produced yesterday. They produced what's called a cost estimate, which is 64 pages in length, and an economic analysis, a separate document entirely, but related strongly to the cost estimate, which is about 30 pages in length. On page 15 of the cost estimate, you'll find in table 2 a breakdown of the changes in the population. Now, this is really important. All immigration analysis starts with demography. It doesn't start with political rhetoric or anything like that. It starts with head counts. And they are saying that they're probably wrong about this, but let's take them from what they say, that by 2033, the 20th year in their projection, the total population of the United States will be 16.3 million higher because of immigration. 16.3 million higher because of immigration, because of the changes that this law made. Now, frankly, that represents a drop in immigration. It seems to me, but we'll leave that to one side. If you look into their numbers, one number that is implied but not reported is the number of undocumented residencies. Is that the way they call it? They call it undocumented residency, something like that? These are people who shouldn't be here. They've overstayed their visas or they've crossed the border to get in. Now, this is really interesting. This bill is supposed to reduce the number of people coming into the country, reduce the number of people who are overstaying their visas. We're starting with the threshold issue, right? This is the threshold issue. CBO on page 24, I believe, or 23 of the cost estimate says, because we're going to be issuing so many more student visas and temporary visas and F visas and so forth like that, we believe the number of people who will overstay their visas will increase. Now, I thought that was kind of interesting, and I didn't even have to interpret that. I just had to read the report. And then if you look on page 15, which gives you the projected cumulative changes in the U.S. population attributable to S744, you'll find, doing a little math, it's implied there, that by 2033, 7 million people will be in the population without documents. If you divide that by 20 years, that gives you about 300,000, 350,000 people without documents per year. What is our current rate? 300,000 people per year. In other words, CBO is saying that this bill will make no difference whatsoever to the undocumented residencies, the overstays, the cross borders, and so forth, despite the fact, as Robert said, that this is the #1 border security bill out there. Now let's look at the deficit. Yesterday we heard from Senator Schumer, and we have heard today repeatedly from a lot of people as they get up during morning business, that this is going to reduce the deficit, and in point of fact, it does. If you look on page 12, Table 1, Summary of the Estimated Budgetary Effects of S744, you'll find impact on deficit, about 3/4 of the way down that table, and it says that over the first 10 years, 2014 to 2023, the total government deficit falls by $197 billion. It's a significant accomplishment. Ladies and gentlemen, that number is nuanced because it's made up of two other numbers, one of which is the on-budget deficit, and another was called the off-budget deficit. The on-budget deficit is all the government, the general fund pays for. It pays your income taxes, your corporation tax, your state taxes, users and fees, bada. And the off-budget is Social Security, disability insurance, and SSI. Paid for by what? By payroll taxes. Now, when we do deficit analysis, we're very careful to note that the monies coming to Social Security, DI, and SSI, or SI, are dedicated to those programs. We don't count them, we shouldn't, we don't count them against the deficit in the general fund. When you look at it that way, the off-budget deficit falls by $211 billion. But the on-budget deficit gets worse. In other words, if we take Social Security, disability insurance, and the other things that are paid for by the payroll tax, not Medicare, by the way, because Medicare is paid through the general fund now, out of that calculation, as we should, to look at the deficit that we're responsible for, that we have something we can do something about, that we vote on every year, that deficit gets worse. It gets worse by $14 billion. It gets worse than that in the second 10 years. I'm not making this up. I am simply reading the table. And if we look at the components of the deficit, mandatory spending is what really rises the most. We calculate, and we'll issue this afternoon. I was hoping to bring copies to hand out, but we're not quite ready yet. So everybody will have to rush out and go to the Senate Budget Minority website. We have a document coming out this afternoon that we'll go through in detail to show where the spending is. And $258.9 billion in the first 10 years is attributable to mandatory spending. That is mandatory spending in the first 10 years when the immigration flows are at their lowest from this bill. And that spending, which we kind of think is odd because we thought that this was supposed to be a growth bill. This bill was supposed to be something that was making the economy grow, so we'd have less unemployment insurance and less this and less that. $58 billion more than current law. So let's take and look at the question of the economy. Yesterday, we had a number of senators who are proponents of this bill rise in the Senate for 10-minute speeches arguing that this bill will get the economy moving again. And remember, they're pointing to the 3 and the 5% level changes. Also, an economist after lunch is about the worst thing you could possibly have. So if you want to go to sleep, that's fine with me. Most people do go to sleep during my speeches. However, I'm going to show this fascinating graph here over here. So what I have here is a page from CBO's second report, its economics report. Can you all see that? Okay, this is from the kind of the last group of pages after the text, and this looks at two important dimensions: gross national product. They're showing you GNP here because they're counting the investment of foreign entities in the United States. You're mostly familiar with GDP, but this is GDP plus that. And they're looking at wages. If this bill produced a stronger economy, then we would see benefits on a per capita basis that were higher than baseline. Anybody opposed to that? The graph you're seeing is the result of CBO's own analysis that shows that per capita GNP is below baseline for all but 3 of the 20 years. In other words, even though we have a higher level to the economy, because we have more people, and they're coming in, as Robert said, with lower wages, lower skills, primarily 54% of the expected flow will have less than a high school education. The inevitable result is their additional work product is not enough to lift the per capita rate above the baseline. This is CBO's own work. If I was selling a growth plan, I would lead with a growth chart. I wouldn't just say that the car is bigger, I would also say it's faster. Because if I have a bigger car and it goes slower than my old rattletrap, then I have not actually improved things at all. And one of the reasons why we have a slower economy is that amazingly, we have slower wage growth. Average wages for the first 12 years are below current law projections. Not just for me. By the way, I work for the Senate, so my average wage is really going to be low. But for you, average doesn't mean average person. It means statistical average. So it's fitting in all the ones who are growing and all the ones that's falling, and it's hitting that average. We have had below average growth in wages for the past 7 years. We have another 12. Does that mean America has to wait for 19 years before we get back to wage growth that is positive? Is this what this bill is saying? Is this bill saying that if we didn't pass 744, is this analysis saying if we didn't pass 744, we would have a stronger economy? Yes. The analysis speaks for itself. I'm not making this up. You can interpret it various and sundry ways. I'll give you that. But it isn't a clear case, is it, that this is a good thing? All right, so we get total factor productivity. You thought I would avoid that one, but Robert brought it up. How do we get a more productive economy? CBO has a lot of words in their report. I urge you to read it. It's a good document to read. And in the middle of this economics report, they start to talk about how we get more productivity in the economy. How did this happen? Well, part of it is because unit labor costs fall. That's one of the reasons you get more productivity. It's the simple fact of dropping costs, all right? The other thing is that they say, not in our model, but in our theory, we believe that people will come in from other countries with really good ideas in technology and science, and they will make the kinds of things that Americans want to buy. Well, that could be true. We could be invaded, settled, migrated to by the brightest people in the entire world. and they'll do all these wonderful things for us. But if the only thing standing between me and negative GDP is a bunch of well-meaning foreign scientists, I think I'd rather have current law than 744. My views are not the views of the Senate of the United States or of Senator Sessions, but if he were here, he'd probably say the same thing. Thank you very much.
All right, well, we have time for some questions, so if you would, we are taping this event to be on our website within 24 hours, so please wait for a microphone to come to you and just announce your name and if you want an affiliation as well. Let's see, I've got one way over here. Just wait for that microphone. Thanks.
Hey, okay, this question is for Bill Beach. So you suggested that passing 740... Is this on?
It's on.
Okay. You suggested passing 744 would ultimately result in a weaker economy. Do you believe that if we never passed the Reagan amnesty, the economy would be stronger now?
That's a very good question, Kevin. I know who he is. So when we passed the bill in 1986, almost all of the non-documented people got amnesty, and they were given legal status. And their contributions have been positive. All right. My guess is that if we had the same population as we had in 1986, of people who were here without documents and they were given a pathway to citizenship, that in point of fact we would have, we would have positive results. I'm not suggesting that we wouldn't. But there are two things to keep in mind that are, I think, big differences between now and 1986. First off, if you look at CBO's report of May the 8th, 2013, when they update their population projections and their analysis of the immigrant population, you will notice that since the 70s and 80s, we have had a pronouncedly bigger increase in the population which is low-skilled and low-educated. Now, no fault of these people. The low skills and low educated are oftentimes due to the fact that their home countries lack the means to prepare them for the kinds of skill set that is required in an advanced economy like ours. Nevertheless, it means that they generally are working in lower wage jobs without the opportunity for saving, starting up businesses, or contributing at a higher level. We don't really need a lot more low-skilled people in this country to provide services for high-skilled people, so the complementarity factor, which you saw back in 1986, so important, of freeing the time of people with the education and with the skills to do things, is probably not needed now. We have a lot of unemployment, by the way, in the low-skilled areas, so there's a lot of slack in that part. But the second thing, Robert can elaborate on this, that is so different, is that we have had a vast increase in the transfer society and the welfare state. This is in part due to design. It is also the designed repudiation of the Welfare Reform Act. This is partly due also to the unwillingness of the government to unwind many of the expansions to welfare which were put in place during the Great Recession. So if we were in fact now to take this population which lacks the skills to compete at higher levels, and because they will have trouble finding jobs, put them into a place where dependency can become a way of life, then I would answer your question by saying no, the pathway to citizenship this time would not result in the same economic gains.
All right, here in the front.
Yes, I have a two-part question. Mr. Beach, Alex is my name. Mr. Beach, is the intellectual father of dynamic scoring. I was curious as to why you were so critical of the CBO's first attempt to do that. And Mr. Rector, are you going to produce a dynamic study of the current immigration bill? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll be brief. I have a poor memory, but I thought I began my remarks by thanking the CBO for doing just that. And if I failed to say that, then let me say it now. I thought this was a very good piece of work in many respects. It is not their first dynamic score, by the way. They now are doing it more and more, and thank you for saying that I had something to do with that. I don't think I had, but this is a situation in which they are doing dynamic scoring, but keeping them as separate documents is sort of, we're having sex, but we're having it in separate rooms now, and it may be a good step in that direction. I think they should have better documented their work. I think they should have provided a methodological appendix, but I have to congratulate them in taking the step towards the dynamic analysis of this legislation.
Contrary to what certain people say, such as the esteemed social science researcher Grover Norquist, my score was what could be called semi-dynamic in the sense that I assume that people change their behavior once they're legalized. I assume that they change their behavior with respect to benefits once you give them access to benefits. But I also had background assumptions in there that said, look, if we have illegals in the country, they will have increased the capital investment, and that capital investment has been taxed. That's all quantified in there. I also make some conventional assumptions that the number of illegals in the country, at least in the short term, has reduced the wages of competing low-skilled workers, and I estimate that. So that's all in there, and that would cover just the full range of things that I think you need to talk about. There are a few other, now we have 3 other models that use a computable general equilibrium model. The problem with a computable general equilibrium model is that you basically get what on the output side what you assume on the input side. So if you assume, for example, that this immigration flow is going to cause an increase in total factor productivity, shock, it comes out the other end. I don't know how that happens, but it does. And so Cato, for example, has 2 studies that show that bringing more immigrants in and even more low-skill immigrants, which CBO is not trying to show, but even more low-skill immigrants in causes the standard of living of U.S. citizens or the wages of U.S. citizens to go up by, say, 2%. And you could ask the question, how did that happen? Well, it's because the author of the study assumed that it would happen, it puts that into the model, and it comes out the other side. The question is that whether or not that's a reasonable assumption, again, within the overall body of literature, this is very strange, okay? The National Academy of Sciences, when they studied this back in their report in 1996, say categorically that immigration, when you bring it in, makes the GDP larger, but it categorically does not increase the per capita GDP. So the average citizen is not better off. That is what you would find in almost any textbook about this, and the bulk of research. There's also a very interesting meta-analysis of the relationship between population growth and per capita GDP growth. And you have to distinguish between GDP growth, more laborers always makes a bigger pie, but the reality is that the immigrant and foreign investors take most of the gain from that bigger pie. And so you have to distinguish between GDP growth and GDP per capita growth. Again, most research would confirm the National Academy of Sciences that just because you have more immigrants, the standard of living of the average citizen is not better off, and in particular, the post-tax standard of living is negative with respect, as the OECD now says, in the United States, because the benefits received by the immigrant flow exceed the taxes paid in. Therefore, the U.S. citizens have to pay for that difference.
All right. More questions? Over here.
Hi, I'm Caleb. You guys both mentioned that roughly 54%, I think you said, of the immigrants that will be coming have nothing greater than a high school education. And there's speculation that Democrats are looking to increase the minimum wage by at least $2 or somewhere around $2. And I was wondering what you thought that could have as an effect on the economy with roughly 6 million immigrants looking for work in low-skilled jobs that are most likely minimum wage.
If I could just take a quick stab at that, that sounds like a political question, and I won't get into it, but it is a good question. Yes, the numbers are as you portray them. If in fact this report shows that wages are going to be below average, it would certainly set a predicate, would it not, for raising the minimum wage. But I would like to say something that's related to this, and I meant to say this earlier. I think it's important for sophisticated audiences watching public policy debates to not jump to the assumption that because you oppose passage of 744 or oppose a part of that, that you're opposed to immigration. I really think that gets us nowhere. I have showed you this morning reasons why a pro-growth Democrat or Republican might oppose 744, because it doesn't provide the growth. The answer would be, of course, to make sure that you're getting the right types of skills into the country, given the type of economy that you have. And so I think that we need to use the CBO score in this debate to get a deeper understanding of what kind of immigration bill we want, or bills. But not to stop immigration by polarizing it and saying everyone who opposes 744 is opposed to immigrants. That's simply inaccurate and not productive.
If I could elaborate on that point, because I think it's very important. What CBO has said to us here basically is that they sort of think, on the basis of a few studies, that if you had more high-skill immigration coming in, that there could be synergistic effects. There could be an increase in invention and scientific research, which would cause a change in technology, which would have an impact on productivity. Everyone would agree to that, okay? So let's set aside the fact that out of 2,400 articles, only 2 show this effect coming from immigration, and say, okay, let's buy that. But the fact of the matter is that what they're in essence arguing is that all of that that productivity growth is coming from about 1/10 of the immigrants that they're bringing in, the very, very tiny portion that happen to be high skill. And as I said, even among temporary workers, they're bringing in 7 low skill for every high skill. So if you believe that CBO is right in that, and again, we should, if this is really true, we should probably be setting up several foundations to analyze this particular phenomenon. But you could get that without amnesty and without all the rest of the stuff that's in this bill, which happens to be low or moderate skill immigration, for which they provide virtually no even suggestion that that's going to have that impact. And again, as I said earlier, the fact of the matter is that our society transfers from more talented workers with a college degree, whether they are immigrants or not immigrants. They pay roughly $30,000 a year more in taxes than they receive in benefits. They do that roughly throughout their lives. That group is actually sometimes fiscally positive even in retirement because of the savings that they have. And all that $30,000 a year goes to pay for benefits for somebody else. And that type of immigrant, in fact, could benefit us economically and certainly does benefit us unquestionably fiscally, but there are very, very few of those in this bill.
All right, we have time maybe for one more. Let's go right here.
My name's David. Is this on?
It is.
Mr. Rector, your analysis found that 70% of Americans actually increase the deficit because they don't have a college education. And you use this to conclude that we'd be better off without immigrants, without college educations. But this analysis also seems to imply that we would also be better off without the 70% of Americans who also lack a college education. Do you believe that we would be better off without 70% of our workforce?
I believe that as a nation, we would be better off if the workforce was better educated, not less well educated. And what this bill does is it actually reduces the average education level of U.S. workers. The fact of the matter is, if you have individuals in the United States that do not have a college education, they're here. Most of us in public policy would have worked pretty hard to try to get their education levels up. We spend a lot of money on that because we understand that people with those very low skill levels impose social and economic and fiscal costs. That's why we do that. That's why we spend a lot of money on that. The issue is whether you want to bring more people like that from abroad. Most Americans assume that we have a moral obligation to the least advantaged American workers. That's why we have this transfer system. That's why we have effectively free public education for poor parents. It's why we heavily subsidize Medicare and Social Security for the least skilled American workers. But we can barely, and I mean emphasize the word barely, afford that system of transfer and support for U.S.-born citizens and a small number of legal immigrants. The question is whether you want to have an ever larger and larger flow of people that will be fiscally dependent coming from abroad. The other implication of your assessment is that somehow the low-skill immigrants, and KDOD likes to argue this, move other workers up to more productive jobs. That analysis makes no economic sense. There's no basis to it. And it implies that there are large numbers of people currently in the U.S. that are working at jobs below their marginal productivity level, and that there's an abundance of vacancies that they can shift upward into. I didn't know that, you know? It's kind of remarkable why we're supposed to have millions of workers that are working at low productivity jobs, openings for jobs above them, and they don't move up into those, but somehow when immigrants come in, you get this upward push effect. And the alternative explanation would be people are roughly working at their productivity. There's not an abundance of open on higher skilled jobs. And when you have lots of low skilled people coming in, they compete with the low skilled workers already there. Wages go down, and large numbers of the low skilled American workers simply drop out of the labor force entirely, which is what has happened. And just let me say one point on that. A very interesting aspect of this bill is that it now sets the new norm for full employment at 8.5%. Okay, when I got into this field, 4% was full employment, then we got to 4.5, and 4% was what, you know, that's what I learned as an undergrad, 4%, okay? This bill says, as long as unemployment does not go above 8.5%, we are going to continue to have a massive inflow of low-skill temporary workers to compete with U.S. low-skilled workers, because obviously there's so, you know, we don't have enough laborers. And the reality is if you have an overall unemployment rate of 8.5%, the unemployment rate of workers with a high school degree or less is going to be around 17%. Okay? So what he's saying, as long as we have an unemployment rate for U.S.-born workers and legal immigrants of less than 17 or 18%, then we figure we need more low-skilled workers to come into the economy. And what they're really saying is we don't give a darn about those low-skilled workers whose wages have not gone up for decades and who currently face very high levels of unemployment that are not getting better in any time soon. They just basically put them on the sideline and say, we don't care about your participation in the economy in the future.
So your answer is yes, that we would be better off without the 70%?
I would say that we'd be better, as I said, to have the average education level of all workers go up, and that's the way to answer that. And I would say that the average worker does not benefit by increasing the flow of low-skilled immigrants into the country. They suffer the worst.
All right, well, we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank all of you for your careful attention, and let's also please thank our panelists one more time. We're adjourned.